times. So let me start by positing uh, what I want to speak about in terms of global roots of discrimination and the politics of inclusion. Now, uh, so that this is easily understandable across disciplines, I have tried to, keep it in a historical context so that students of economics, political science, sociology, history can easily relate to what I'm saying. So post World War II, this the two promises of contemporary times, that of a welfare state and of representative democracy, the two pillars on which capitalism in contemporary times, especially post the Second World War, stood, is the starting point that I take. That's the historical context. Now, uh, I will be drawing on two major debates or two very scholarly bodies of work. One is from economics, which is the work on discrimination and social exclusion. And the second is the very lively debate that has happened in political philosophy on recognition, redistribution, and representation, Nancy Fraser and others. Now, one of the first things I want to lay out is the mainstream neoclassical discourse on of a capitalist economy, a capitalist society, is based on the idea that individuals, by their uh, own efforts, by their self-maximizing utility calculus, will actually be able to improve their own life chances. That's essentially the neoclassical mainstream, the bedrock of understanding. Now, starting from the end of the Second World War up to the 60s, the period of the 50s actually started throwing up results and issues which were not easily explainable by modern economics, which is that if this system was supposed to be an individual based system, then uh, the entire situation of recurring overlaps between people who are being left out belonging to a particular group wouldn't exactly be happening, right? So what I mean is that there was a consistent overlap that could be observed between people who belong to a certain group in terms of identity, who are being left out from the gains of capitalism. Right? Now, this actually had very interesting takeoff points in America and in France. Two examples I would use to situate this kind of a situation. The American labor market in the 50s actually started showing two kinds of things. One is that there would be jobs which were only white male oriented. And the second is that the jobs which had men, women, and people of color would show what economists would call a wage discrimination. That is, there's a gap between salaries earned or wages earned between people of different colors and gender. This threw up a conundrum in terms of mainstream uh, economic theorization, which was that the color and the gender of people shouldn't have mattered in a capitalist market because it's driven by the idea that individuals on their own merit and performance, what economists would call productivity, would be able to crack these kind of barriers. But that was not to be, right? And this essentially gave rise to a situation where they were having to frontally address this problem as to why there were only white only enterprises or why there were these wage gaps between whites and blacks, why there were these wage gaps between different genders. I should also say at the same time that just for historical uh, clarity, that women actually during the Second World War were doing all the kind of things that men would do. So, in a certain sense, once the men came home after the war, uh, the women were pushed back from the labor market. Okay, so in a certain sense, it wasn't that as if women hadn't broken the glass ceiling, but they had broken the glass ceiling and were pushed back again, which is why a lot of churning was happening. So it's in this backdrop that that the economics of discrimination actually came about. The economics of discrimination, very interestingly, I mean, one could well imagine that it would come from the left wing of economics, but it actually came from the right wing of economics. Okay, it came from the Chicago School, and Gary Becker, who went on to win a Nobel Prize in economics later, in his PhD thesis, actually speaks about frontally addresses this question. Now, as I told you, it it is quite obvious why the mainstream and the neoclassical school would want to address this question theoretically, because the empirical evidence which was showing overlap of marginalized identity and class identity, that is, people who were being left behind in class terms, in economic terms, were also belonging to certain socially marginalized identities, would mean that the ideological promise of capitalism uh, was not being fulfilled. Now, obviously, the claim was that discrimination and exclusion and all these things happened in the past. These were feudal things, and capitalism would have changed it. Right. So, post the Second World War period, when these things started coming up, there needed to be an explanation. Gary Becker actually gave a thesis, term to it actually in his thesis, which was, he said, well, he was trying to explain why white firms would hire more white people, right? And he used the term taste for discrimination. Okay, now I'll just explain this term. Essentially, you see, just to understand this from an economics perspective, any firm would be actually wanting to save costs, especially wage costs, and hire the cheapest labor. That's what one would expect, right? So, in a white-dominated economy, it would be more efficient and more rational for firms to hire workers who would demand a lower wage, namely blacks and women. But they, in fact, went on to hire white male workers whose wages were higher, and hence weren't exactly, in that quote unquote sense, the most rational thing to do in terms of profit maximization, because your wage costs would go up. So Becker used this term taste for discrimination. Essentially, in economics, when we talk about consumer preferences, we use this quite a lot, which is to say, I prefer Pepsi over a Coke. Right? That's my taste for discrimination, and whatever it is, I would have a Pepsi over Coke. Now that kind of a thing, or I prefer the color red to the color white, etc., etc. Now that taste for discrimination thesis actually, in he wrote this around 57. It started gaining ground because it could actually explain why, even at a cost to themselves, firms would go in for a discriminatory kind of a thing. Uh, Interestingly, the idea was, if you follow the the neoclassical understanding of perfect competition in markets, firms which would not be able to be cost efficient would ultimately get driven out of the market. But again, this was not the case. So the taste for discrimination thesis, of course, came under a lot of criticism because it sounded pretty racist. So there was an attempt again in post Becker, post Gary Becker, by others, professors in Stanford and others, Kenneth Arrow for one, uh, who wasn't a right wing Chicago school person, but Kenneth Arrow, who was also a Nobel laureate later for his work in economics, and Edmund Phelps, another Nobel laureate. both of them basically came up with an idea of statistical discrimination. Now, let me just explain this. Let's just imagine a scenario of jobs in the labor market. So essentially, when we are saying white people prefer white people, it's because when they appear for the interview, that's where the discrimination is happening, right? So they said that, well, so Becker was saying that once a person appears for the interview, you see the person and you have a preference kind of a situation, right? But Arrow and Phelps basically explained the situation by saying, well, what employers look for, which is what will happen to all of us when we go out in the market, is to understand how efficient or productive we will be. Now, the point is, during the interview, you cannot figure out what a person's productivity is going to be once you hire that person. You might hire me as a professor, and I get the job and I don't teach. Okay, there's no way that you know beforehand what I will do post getting the job. Okay, because there is no test for productivity at the interview stage. So employers would start using proxies for productivity, which is they would try and use some marker of productivity which wasn't proved yet, right? So what would willy-nilly happen is that the marker would become race or gender, right? So basically now what would happen is statistically using a proxy for productivity, people of color and women would not be hired. It's kind of a different explanation than Becker's, but basically this is what uh, was essentially being explained from the American economics realm. So you can imagine the situation in the 50s and the 60s in America, where there was civil rights movements, feminist movements, others who were essentially protesting against unequal treatment and inequalities in society. And this explanation was aimed at countering uh, why there could be a discriminatory kind of treatment. Now, this is the birth of the economics of discrimination in a certain sense. Now, let's go across the oceans. In France, around the same period, in the 60s, there is a left wing government uh, of Chirac, and they essentially are trying to see they have a welfare state as opposed to America, which had at that point of time market kind of a market-driven society without the state intervening much in the market. Uh, you have a very different kind of orientation of the state in France at that point of time, and a lot of Western Europe, where they had consciously taken on the idea of the welfare state. So they wanted to do a, a a kind of an evaluation as to how well the welfare state was working. Right. So this is 60s France, where René Lenoir, the Minister of Interior in the left-wing government, was tasked with looking at producing a report to see how many French men, of course, at that point of time, given patriarchal norms, it was how many French men were being excluded in from the welfare state idea. Right? Now, very interestingly, they came up with a list of 10, 12, unemployed people, aged people, substance abuse people who've done substance abuse, people who are differently abled, etc., etc., and came up with a list of people which kind of was almost 10% of the French population who were feeling who were left out. This is what gave rise to the term of social exclusion. So, in a certain sense, there were people who were being excluded from the welfare state. This gives rise to the study of social exclusion. And this is what essentially Amartya Sen later uh, writes about, drawing from that kind of lineage, about people who are being excluded from this kind of a welfare state. Right? What René Lenoir's report also found that was almost like 1 in 10 Frenchmen, so that's like almost 10% of the population was feeling excluded. Okay. Now, So this kind of a context actually gave rise to the study of discrimination and exclusion across different continents, and then slowly starts emerging into a field on its own. Right? One thing to just outline here and remember is that there were different ways of becoming French and American, etc., etc., in terms of citizenship and other kinds of rights. So, when we are speaking of inclusion in the French sense, you had to be French. So, there, whatever your individual markers were, you would have to accept that French citizenship idea. So, the inclusion would or citizenship would be granted on those terms, right? Whereas in other parts of the world, it's not exactly in a similar kind of a fashion. Okay. Now, I'll come back to this. I'm just laying out the difference because what's been happening recently in terms of Black Lives Matter in America or the tensions in France at this point of time can very well be traced back to these kind of moments in history. So I'm just laying that part out so that we remember, that this was the context through which this kind of a situation comes, the study of discrimination, exclusion in a certain way. So another thing to remember in the French case is the categories that were being described in terms of people who are being excluded were actually, if you come to think of it, people who were not as productive as others. So essentially, it was trying to say that people left out of the productivity calculus of a capitalist market are people who are feeling socially excluded. Okay, so what it points to, very interestingly, is in the period which is often called, referred to as the golden age of capitalism, which is the post-World War II period till 1970s. Those 30 years of state intervention, welfare state, etc., etc., were actually giving rise to a lot of discrimination and social exclusion. Now, one thing could be that, of course, data about these things were being actively uh, collated, and hence people could say definitive things about it, and hence it became very important in modern social science. Again, like I'm saying, discrimination and exclusion did happen before as well, so it's not something that is new. Now, this is the context of how it emerges in economics. Okay. Now, let me come to the second aspect, which is the representative democracy part. Now, of course, it is a well-known debate, and I'm not a political scientist, so students of political science can refer to the very lively debate on recognition and redistribution that happened between Nancy Faeser, Judith Butler, Iris Melania. There are others as well, Alex Honnold, uh, Richard Rorty, a lot of scholarship on around Charles Taylor around looking at these kind of issues. Now let me just basically lay out the issue here because there's not a lot of time to speak about this. But the essential point being that the interpretation of people being left out or the roots of inequality for that period of time, mostly by Marxists, uh, would basically reduce all of this to the economic sphere, right? So, drawing from Marx, the economic order of distributive relations at that point of time would be something that gave rise to class inequality. Okay, so that's one trace coming from a very orthodox reading of Marx, but that's what was primarily the explanation at that point of time. However, again, the same thing that one can do with theories of discrimination and exclusion, one can do here as well. Was that essentially, hence, the politics would be a politics of redistribution. Right? So, if it's economic distribution which is leading to this kind of an issue, then the articulation of transformation would also be that this economic, it should be based on an economic redistribution. That's essentially what you identify Marxists as saying. Now, there was a lot of there was a lot of issues, especially with the second wave feminist movement throwing up these questions, the civil rights movement, and other movements across the world, actually, which was saying that this was economic reductionism, that this was not the only way, things were proceeding. And this cultural turn, in a certain way, if I may call it, others have also labeled it as that, is where identities became more important, and hence their purely redistributive aspects in terms of economic spheres were not taken to be the complete set of understandings and the complete framework. In this, what gets added is the question of recognition of identity. Okay. Now, of course, Nancy Fraser has later moved to, you know, to the status model. I'll come to that, but let's just keep this identity focused for now. This actually, means if you take the notion of identity and status as well, it's a Weberian kind of an idea, right? That there would be hence status inequalities, and hence the cultural and recognition kind of relations would be defining that in so far as that if there is a constant recurrence of certain identities and certain groups being discriminated and marginalized, then obviously they are not getting included. So a, a politics of inclusion, in a certain sense, would entail a recognition of the cultural and the identity form or the basis of the situation. Now, again, there was and there is still, I think, a great amount of friction and a healthy friction in terms of understanding these two as two different poles, right? The redistributive aspect as one end of the spectrum, and the recognition aspect is another end of the spectrum. Right? So, if relying on Marx and Weber's ideas of class status, and of course Weber had a third, which is party, what we actually try doing, and this is where Fraser and others have done fantastic theorizations about, which is to see that there's a culture, there's an entwinement between the class inequalities and the status inequalities, which is, in a certain sense, intertwined or entwined amongst each other. So now this gives rise to a third kind of a thing. So there's an economic redistributive aspect, which is just purely class. There's a cultural recognition kind of a situation, which is, identity, and there is a political representation kind of a situation, which is then giving rise to the third aspect, which is that the economic, social, and political spheres are essentially covered by the terms of redistribution, recognition, and representation. Now, that's essentially a way of seeing, of course, in political philosophy, how justice pans out. For our purposes here, we are trying to understand the promise of representative democracy to be able to recognize these differences, to be able to redistribute resources, and to be able to give representation. That's primarily, it's almost in its definition. Now, again, what we see over time is that in this realm of representation, again, you find groups recurrently being marginalized. Okay? So now, the two bedrocks of capitalism, one being the market, would give rise to exclusions. The political structure of democracy representative democracy was also giving rise to similar exclusions. So now, where does that leave us? So this, what we are describing, is a uh, brief look into what post the Second World War period looked like, which is uh, mostly, and this became even more obvious with the with the Cold War and with the end of the Cold War, that the capitalist system and representative democracy would actually lead to transformation. Right? And so that's the last part I want to now come upon. So we've drawn on two kinds of ideas. One is from the economic mainstream to kind of explain why discrimination and exclusion would be happening, but also to look at ways to solve it in a certain sense. Another from political philosophy, drawing on the debates of representation, recognition, redistribution. What we see is how representative democracies were not being inclusive and how could they could become more inclusive. This fundamentally changes, if I may say so, with globalization and with the opening up of most economies around, let's say, post 70s, 80s, especially the end of the 20th century. This now, in the contemporary situation, is where we stand. And interestingly, hence, we need to take a relook at the global roots of discrimination. Now, the global roots of discrimination, as you must by now understood, is what I'm looking at in terms of capitalism. And in a certain sense, very perceptively, a Polish economist called Mikhail Koleski actually spoke about the possibilities or impossibilities in this kind of domain. And let me bring Koleski's idea in, which you might find quite interesting, which is that Koleski actually showed that in that period of the what we are calling, or what is termed as the golden age of capitalism, between 1944 to 70s, let's say, that period, actually, the welfare state, what it was doing uh, was actually giving a lot of rights to workers in social security benefits, maternal benefits, health benefits, education, health, all these things were provided by the state. So, what we are speaking of is a concept, again, which came out of votaries of capitalism, of a full employment society in a certain sense, which could be possible under capitalism. So, in terms of, if you look at this from a different perspective, these problems of exclusion that were happening could actually be addressed if the system could move everyone towards a full employment kind of a situation. Now, Kaleski pointed out the fundamental contradiction of a capitalist society being a full employment society. He articulated the fact that it was impossible that this would become the case. Now, just to keep it in reference again, in that period, those 30-year periods, right, in the 70s, the societies, especially in advanced capitalist countries, did actually move towards a very high level of employment and a lower level of unemployment, which is primarily because the state was intervening in the market. Now, what Kaleski said very perceptively was, and he was actually, he had seen fascism, so he was saying this in reference to what had happened in Nazi Germany, is that in the initial period when the welfare state grants these rights, what obviously starts happening is that workers and their collective bargaining strength increases. Trade unions, different collective forms, these increase, which in turn makes the capitalist, the entrepreneurs, the industrialists not happy because you can't fire people at will. You can't. You have to pay what is rightfully theirs. Maternity benefits have to be given. Health has to be taken care of. All these things taken together make for a very inflexible, quote unquote, labor market, according to them. What a capitalist would obviously like is to have a policy of hire and fire so that they can keep the workers in check and the profit margins can keep increasing. So there will be a hit back from capital, from the industrialists against such a move, which primarily would mean that they would argue for a dismantling of the welfare system. Okay. In Nazi Germany, what happened is that the industrialist class and the business elite actually uh, bankrolled the political formulations of the National Socialist Party, which is the Nazis. And then the political elites, the people in power, Hitler and others, overtook all of that. Right? So the political elite captures, in a certain sense, overtakes the economic elite. And that's what old style fascism was. Now, which essentially means that for that period, that golden age period, Kaleski's explanation was a brilliant one, which showed that why a welfare state uh, would not be able to, in the long run, have a full employment society because at one point of time, the capitalist class would hit back. Okay. Now, in contemporary times, so now this all these explanations, if you and the debates on representation, I mean recognition, redistribution, and all of that, were happening within the framework of a territorial state, right? A national identity of a territorial state. As a globalization and neoliberal capitalism progresses, what one can see that this becomes global and the national entity over time becomes subservient to global uh, capitalist interest. Right? Now, it is in this context that we try and look at what's happening in the recent times. And just to lead into that, so we are seeing that opening up of economies, removal of controls, dismantling of the welfare state ideas were basically happening at a much faster rate towards the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century. What this obviously meant is that uh, capital would move wherever it would find cheap labor. And hence, what it would start doing over time is that whoever in the labor market would be cheaper would actually get picked up. Now, this incidentally gives rise to the insider outsider skirmish, which is between local workers and migrant workers. And that skirmish could then come back into a territorial nation state kind of form, which was that outside workers are coming and taking our jobs. So we must make America first, or we must make India first, or France first, or whatever. This return of a very exclusive kind of nationalism actually happens because the global roots of discrimination have taken over, in a certain sense, all the institutions of capitalism. Now, in a certain sense, what we then see is that these policies of exclusive nationalism, which rely on a sense of discrimination and exclusion also, against an outsider, actually starts making a return. Okay. Now, it's in this context that you see a rise again in movements articulating themselves against this kind of exclusionary politics. So instead of a politics of inclusion, as it is claimed, this politics actually perpetuates exclusion. And movements on the ground would want to visibilize themselves. So the Black Lives Matter, in a certain sense, was protesting against a kind of exclusion and invisibilization that was happening. So to visibilize that kind of a situation, this kind of movement can be read in that context. Similarly, in France. I mean, I'm not even going into uh, what Trump's policies have been, etc., etc. That make Americans first is essentially a way of looking at that. In France, very interestingly, headed by another right-wing government of Macron, they have now come down heavily on universities and social sciences who are talking about discrimination, exclusion, especially race studies, gender studies, saying that these are the forces which are disrupting the internal sanctity of a nation. I know it sounds like India, but this is France. But essentially, to explain why these ideas, which are apparently coming out only of universities, are destabilizing the situation because they are positing these kind of representational issues of inclusion and exclusion at the cost of the French idea of citizenship. So what they're trying to articulate in that is that whatever be your individual markers, you need to leave that aside to become a French citizen. And people who are talking of these differences, these kind of ruptures, representational issues, etc., leading to a destabilization of the society in itself. So at this moment of time, where we stand is a complete circle and very interesting usage of the concepts of discrimination, exclusion, and inclusion. Uh, my attempt in this talk has been to actually lay out the complexities that are there and the very interesting use and abuse of these terms that have happened in the last 60, 70 years. Fundamentally, what also aids this kind of attitude is what also afflicts, in a certain sense, academy, which is to have primarily disciplinary silos. To think, so students of economics would feel that we only should do economics and not understand the politics or the social or the history of it. Other disciplines would also think similar things. So the more we shy away from interdisciplinarity or transdisciplinarity or multidisciplinarity, the more we get pushed into these kind of exclusions. Uh, Partly the exclusions which are happening in society would obviously be reflected within our disciplines. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your extensive talk and giving us the context of evolution of social discrimination. Now we would invite participants to, if you have any questions, even the ones who are there online. Okay, let me only start with one. I was trying to understand what I was able to understand from your first section was that the social discrimination, somewhere you were trying to show us the evolution and the emergence and evolution along with the concept of welfare state. So could you just tell us a little more about how it operated more in terms of classical liberal kind of regimes and how it kind of got converted later when you talk about modern liberalism? So what was it that it did not the idea did not exist at all, or was there a transformation? Could you please highlight a little bit on that? I think you have muted yourself, sir.
Ah,
Okay.
sorry,
Yeah.
I think there would be differences in how political scientists would define classical liberalism and modern liberalism. But let me just try and give my idea, my understanding about it. What I meant is that the contemporary welfare state, as a specific historical phenomena that happens post the Second World War. So I see that as a very modern kind of approach, where the basic tenet, one of the basic tenets of capitalism, that the state will not intervene in the market. laissez-faire, etc., is actually put on the back burner. It's subverted by the state directly intervening in the market. Now, this is not a normal way of capitalism operating, if I may say so, in which capitalism actually, the state creates a safety net with the capitalist working. So that's essentially what I meant by saying the welfare state in that specific historical context, in which all these, which one can see today, actually don't exist anymore, or even if it exists, it only exists for 5 to 7% of the population, the working population. So the it's actually the suspension of one of the basic tenets of capitalism, which was a market economy without state intervention. That is the historically relevant form of the welfare state for me. Uh, I don't know if I managed to answer your question. I didn't go into the classical liberal part of it, but I was trying to understand the modern formulation.
Sure, sir. Thanks. What about our participants? Any? Okay, you can come here so that.
Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon.
Sir, yeah. So my question is that there were 18 years back, in 2013, a movement was coined Black Lives Matters, and in 2020, after the incident of George Floyd, it got a huge support in United States of America. So, there were incidents in which police officers were brutally attacked. The public damages were there, and according to a report of United States of America government, more than 2.5 billion of public property was damaged by that movement. And when asked on a telephonic sample survey, Americans told that they feel that all life matters should be the main agenda instead of Black Lives Matters. And now, and now that Black Lives Matter movement has been nominated for Nobel Peace Prize. So, sir, so we can say that this is getting a new trend that on the name of social justice, on the name of on the name of morals, violence is being justified. Like we can see that Nobel Peace Prize is being given to that movement, but we have seen that police officers were brutally targeted, and there were huge loss of public property. So, sir, what, sir, is it justified or not?
Okay. So Nobel Peace Prizes have also been given to American presidents who've bombed millions of people. So I don't go much by the Nobel Peace Prize. If you ask me as an academic, I think Nobel Peace Prize is basically, or any of these prizes are fundamentally financed in a certain way. So I wouldn't give much importance to who gets a Nobel Prize. Like I said, American presidents who have bombed a lot of people have also gotten Nobel Prizes. Israeli prime ministers who've bombed Palestine have also been given that. So that's okay. The second thing about so in the specific context you're asking, there are two things. One is social justice, and who should be getting or not getting social justice, and the other thing about Black Lives Matter or All Lives Matter. Okay, it's the same kind of thing. In India, when there's affirmative action, people say, why should it be by caste? It should be for anyone, right? Who has an economic kind of idea. So, in that specific context, let me just look at what it means in terms of a social justice formulation. The social justice formulation would be that there's injustices historically happening and recurrent. Hence, there is some redressal required. That's at a philosophical level. On ground, how does it translate? It can translate in two kinds of articulation. One can say from the point of view of representation that we are not being represented enough, and hence we need representation. How do you do that? through policies of equal employment opportunities or equal pay, affirmative action, etc., etc. Reservations. These are very different, various different forms of, addressing social justice claims. Now, this is exactly what the recognition redistribution debates were trying to do. Now, the question is, in terms of an affirmative action or a social justice kind of a plank, if how does one proceed? So one way would be that the group which is being discriminated or feeling socially excluded would want justice on that count. Okay, the easiest way to flatten that movement is to say that the injustice is all over, and hence all should matter. And then essentially, if all have a claim, then the group which is actually being discriminated and wants to have a claim, their claim gets uh, you know diluted. It's very easy. It's like a game of musical chairs. There are 20 chairs, okay? And if 5 chairs are going to go to one group, and if everybody then starts saying that, all of us have the same problem, then out of the 5 that were going to that group, only one, possibly, or maybe none will go. Now that's the brilliance of all lives matter, or saying that reservation or affirmative action should be on the basis of everything and not just the thing that people are saying that they have a issue with. So coming to the last point about violence that you asked, uh, there's some interesting statistics that one needs to look at before we use violence as a term like that. So of course there is violence that happens in protests. Okay, but let's take a look back and look at what is structural violence. You see, when we are saying that marginalized groups are the least represented, let's take America only as an example, or you can take India also as an example. The only institution of the state where the most marginalized people are maximum represented. So in America, the only institution where blacks are overrepresented is the jails, is the prisons. It's the same thing in India. The only place where Dalits, Adivasis, Muslims are overrepresented is in the Indian prisons. Right? Now, that to me points to structural violence. And what happens on the street as a response to that violence is not a good thing. But if you ask me as a social scientist, I would be looking to the structural violence, and the state has a larger role in that structural violence. So, of course, no violence is justified, but I would start by looking at how the state should not be violent in the first place. So, yeah.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Rakshit. Sir, we have two more questions here in the chat section. First one is from Dr. Amrita.
Okay.
Should I read it out?
No, no, I can. I'm just seeing it. How do you see the emerging political alternatives which look like more inclusive to providing? Okay, the 2020 party and other interest group parties as well. You see, this is a subset or a peculiar, not peculiar, or let's say a logical outgrowth of the politics of recognition and representation that will happen. You see, there will be interest groups which could come together on issues, right? How I see that is that
Participants, please mute yourself.
sorry.
Sorry, sir, you can continue.
No, no, no. No issues. Sorry, let me just come back to that. So what I'm saying is, so issue-based politics and issue-based representational forms actually, do happen, and it's bound to happen. Uh, one and what it will do to the political behavior of people is a difficult one to say, but given the given the contours of how a representative democracy actually is, I'm not too surprised that in the short to medium term, these things will gain some traction. Let me just give a concrete example. When we say representative kind of things, elected representatives, in India, a MP will be essentially representing around 20 to 25 lakh people. In America, they would be representing around 5 lakh people. In the UK, it will be much lesser. Okay. Now, it's obviously impossible for one person to be representing so many people. The second thing is, in these kind of electoral democracies, what is bound to happen and is happening is that the cost of running and winning an election becomes extremely high. So it actually excludes most people from being represented in that way. In which case, taking recourse to the corruption of this kind of situation, lot you see, because if you have to win the election, you also have to give back to the people who bankrolled you post the election. So in that kind of a situation, systemic corruption will emerge, and the representative interests of people actually on ground will not get represented. So there will be an impetus for new interest groups to come about to address these very local issues. And I think if you're referring to the 2020 party there, or let's say even in Delhi, Aam Aadmi Party, when it comes about, or any other party which is very local and interest based, will get some traction. And I think that has to do with the impossibility of inclusion in a representative democracy. So, in a certain sense, I think that's the lacuna it fills for a short to medium period. But whether it will survive or not depends on how well they can do, they can articulate a politics of representation as well as one of redistribution. Because if the redistribution does not happen, then pure representation will not solve the issue for them. So yeah.
So
Okay,
there's
there's
one more
another
question.
question. Huh, right. Uh, the biggest example. Mhm. Okay, one is mm, if I understand it, Russia was not a welfare state. A welfare state typically is a capitalist state which intervenes in the market by going back on its main promise. It's like I promise something and then I do something else. The Russian, I mean, I assume you're talking about Soviet Union. That was a communist state. So, I don't think it was a welfare state. It was a very different kind of a state. Uh, just to give you an example of the difference, there was no right to private property. The right to private property is fundamental to a capitalist state or a welfare state, which essentially means that this idea of individuals, uh, which should be the principle of capitalism, actually does not operate. What operates is the benefits of who you know and networks, etc., etc. So the study of discrimination exclusion actually shows that what capitalism promises, it doesn't practice, and what it practices is a very network-based meritocracy, in which people who actually make the cut think they do it because of their individual merit. Now, that's an interesting concept of alienation that operates, where people think they are what they are because just of their own. This highly individualized, atomized idea is a good one. It's a good marketing gimmick of capitalism, and it works because most of us actually believe we have reached where we've reached only by ourselves and nothing else. But that, as a social scientist, I find it difficult to believe. I don't know if I answered your question. You might want to say, uh, I mean, if something more if you want. I don't know if I answered your question. I mean, why do we still continue to debate the pros and cons of capitalism and welfare state? Is because that's the context under which we live. And the failure of an experiment over 70, 80 years does not mean the failure of a ideology in itself. I mean, capitalism itself is quite young as well. So, and no ism stays for too long. So, I'm I'm hopeful that the debates can continue.
Yeah. Any more
Thanks.
questions from our participants here? No? Okay, now, thank you. So I think those are the questions. I'll call Ms. Pragya to give the vote of thanks.
Gratitude is the fairest blossom which springs from the soul. Warm greetings to one and all. I, Pragya, on behalf of all my dear fellow Christites, stand before you to propose the vote of thanks. Firstly, I would like to thank God the Almighty for blessing us with this great day. I extend my sincere gratitude to Reverend Father Dr. Viju, Dean and Director of Christ, deemed to be University, Delhi NCR, and Reverend Father Dr. Sunny, our campus administrator, even in their absence, for their constant support. It is under their guidance and mentoring that we were able to conduct such an amazing guest lecture. Next, I would like to express my gratitude and the politics of inclusion. I thank the IT department for all their services for the successful completion of this event. I would also express my gratitude to Sulakshmi everyone for making this event a successful one. Thank you and have a beautiful evening ahead.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir. You can sign out. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.